All right, so I'm going to talk about the works of Martin Gardner. The reason for this talk is self-promotion. Now, the book obviously is the result of a lot of work. It's a big, fat book, and I'm proud, just as you might guess, have an introduction by Donald Knuth. And he says, "I love to witness a labor of love. Dana Richards has spent more than half of his life accomplishing an almost impossible task to catalog and put in order the writings of one of the most prolific authors the world has ever known. And it is a lot of work, but it is a labor of love." Now, the 25 minutes is a long time for me to be given, and I appreciate it, but obviously I can't do much to tell you about the works of Martin Gardner in just that amount of time. So I'm going to concentrate more on the breadth of Gardner. Most of the talks here are deep dives on a subject. In fact, I always tell people that the reason I come to Gathering for Gardner is it's a conference in which everybody comes to tell each other what they would rather be telling Martin Gardner himself. But I'm not going to try to do too much today. I am going to organize the talk around the table of contents of the book. So under mathematics, we have that, and it's divided into sections, as you might guess. There are some unusual entries, like propositional calculus with directed graphs, with Harari. Now, Gardner almost never co-authored anything, but Harari co-authors with everybody. So that's an occupational hazard. But in his book on logic, machines, and diagrams, Gardner invented his own graphical representation of propositional logic, and Harari said, "Oh, I did something like that," and they got this article out of it. I'm just pointing out, again, the breadth here, that here's an article in Computers and Mathematics with Applications on a game that he invented and analyzed. Changing to less scholarly stuff, and he was a contributing editor to games magazines for many years, and so he got to go through his files and write articles like this. And another thing is my favorite funny quickies for the Four-Star Puzzler, a forgotten magazine that Games published. And here's something quite different. He was very interested in origami. Now, he became interested in origami for odd reasons, mainly because one of his mentors, Unamuno, did paper folding as well. At this time in the 1950s, actually, origami had pretty much fallen out of favor in Japan, and he, with some people like the matriarch of the Kruskal family, reintroduced paper folding, and it took off again in the 1950s. He was involved with an exhibit, and this was an article that he was asked to write for Encyclopedia Britannica. Recreational linguistics. A lot of this is sometimes mixed up with recreational math. So we had many articles in journals like Wordways, Mathematics and Wordplay. He helped start this journal. He was approached by Dmitri Borgman, and Dmitri Borgman didn't know what to do, and so Gardner helped start this journal, which went for at least 53 volumes, I think. Now, the Scientific American column is the one I'm going to talk the least about, because really there's nothing I can say that you don't know about that. And it was published many, many times, including editions that many of you haven't seen. It was translated 70 different times, and these are two British editions. The Isaac Asimov Science Fiction magazine is another chapter, in which, as many of you know, he wrote a puzzle for Isaac Asimov's magazine, in which he had the daunting task of creating a puzzle, which the answer was at the end of another article, which posed another problem, which had another puzzle, and all the puzzles had to be related, which seems easy to do until you realize he had to do it for 91 times. And so it was really quite the accomplishment, and it's been published in various books, 3 books. Collect them all. Science and philosophy. Again, as most of you know, but maybe have forgotten, that his major was in philosophy at the University of Chicago. And he was very much interested in this. He took deep dives, more than any of his fellow students did, into philosophy. And early on, like in 1950, he published Mathematics in the Folkways in the Journal of Philosophy. Now, this is an article not about mathematics, so to speak. This is an article about cultural relativism. And that people, he had no patience for people who said, in another culture, 1 + 1 might not equal 2. So, Computers Near the Threshold, Journal of Consciousness Studies. So here he is, of course, talking about the history of thinking machines and so forth. He doesn't do artificial intelligence, of course, but he is quite concerned about this and wrote about it. 1952, the Journal of Philosophy and Phenomenological Research is Nature Ambidextrous. Now, this was written 7 years before he wrote his book, The Ambidextrous Universe. And so he was, again, very interested in this sort of stuff at one time. And it predated that book, which was basically about a thing that was happening in physics at the time. I can't help but point out that in 1952 he was already quoting Lewis Carroll and Bertrand Russell. I want to point out that he once told somebody that Bertrand Russell was his favorite philosopher. And they asked him why, and he said, Bertrand Russell is, to the best of my knowledge, the only philosopher who's ever changed his mind. Fate magazine, not a scholarly magazine, thank you very much. He did write The Robots Are Coming in 1952. Perceptual and motor skills. Perseveration in healthy subjects. Now, this is an example of where somebody communicated with him. He told him, hey, you could do this, try this. And almost always the people went off and tried that. But on occasions, the people would say, well, I'm not only going to try it, but I'll make you a co-author. Now, we all know about fringe science. And again, it's not emphasized at this meeting, which I don't understand. We should have more emphasis at this meeting on these other interests of Gardner. Fringe science is, in fact, I would say more people in the world know who Martin Gardner is through fringe science than they do through mathematics. Okay? It's an easily true statement. And he's started with this article in 1950, The Hermit Scientist. And this was talking about the 3 things that were popular at the time. I forget what they are: UFOs, Dianetics, and something else. And but the point here is that he focused on these things because he felt that this had to be talked about. It offended his sense of the integrity of science, which he always had relied upon. So somebody told him he should work more on this, and of course that became the book In the Name of Science. But an earlier article, for example, It's Smart to Be Fooled, was written about how experts who aren't privy to how things really work are useless in analyzing how things work. And he quotes Houdini here. And his whole article is many, many examples of the fact that native intelligence isn't the same as being able to figure out how people fool you. And so it's a good article. Now, this is the only article. People think that he wrote about pseudoscience all the time, but in the 1960s he didn't. He was too busy. This is the only article he wrote about pseudoscience in that decade. It was published in Science magazine. It's dermo-optical perception, a peek down the nose. So he was trying to explain to all these people at the time who were taking charlatans into their laboratories, and they were putting blindfolds on and doing spectacular things. He said, look, it's really, really quite easy how to do this trick. And this is sort of a one-off, but it does illustrate his breadth of interest. All right, in the magazine Free Inquiry, Science, Fantasy, Religious Cults. It was mainly about Ray Palmer, as you can read there, one of the people who came out of the science fiction community and became larger than life like Hubbard did. On a lighter note, Physics Teacher magazine. He wrote a lot for Physics Teacher magazine. And here's an article on basically how you can do your own PK, psychokinetics. And you can fool people, and it was a lighthearted article. Whoops-a-daisy. And in this bizarre magazine called Footprints, he had an article on perpetual motion, illusion, and reality. And the Skeptical Inquirer column. Now, again, this might not be the right room for it, but this is his most famous thing he did. In the Skeptical Inquirer, he wrote a series of articles called The Notes of the Fringe Watcher. And in this particular issue, it was Claiborne Pell, Senator from Outer Space. Now, philosophy of science. Now we're getting back to his real interests. All right, so he did a lot of this. He famously was a student of Carnap's and worked with Carnap for many years. But here's an example of why I concentrate on everything he's written, not just the high points. By concentrating on everything he's written, you get things like this, which is the reply to a letter in a newspaper. Right? And you learn things like, I believe the mind is a function of the material brain. The trouble is no one fully understands matter. Okay? So he's obviously putting himself out there on his belief systems, and he's aligning himself with Penrose in terms of maybe quantum effects might affect things and so forth. So, philosophy and theology. Now, most people, again, here may not know that he wrote a fair bit about theology. And he had this thing that everybody would write to him and said, because you're an atheist, and you'd always have to write back to him and says, I'm not an atheist. I'm a philosophical deist. But regardless of that, he collected his philosophical thoughts into a massive volume called The Whys of a Philosophical Scrivener, which was reviewed in New York Review of Books by George Groth. And it was a scathing review, absolutely scathing review of this book, saying how naive Gardner was to believe all of these things. And then the last line it says, George Groth, by the way, is one of Gardner's pseudonyms. This is another intersection of pseudoscience and religion. Glossolalia, talking in tongues. He had a great deal of experience with this where he grew up, and he keeps up with it. He has files on every subject. I speak in the present tense because these files still exist. Just as another example in the theology direction, so he published in a couple things in the Journal of Holocaust Studies, and he once got a nasty letter about this, saying, how dare you even think you can talk about the Jewish people? And he reminded him that his wife was Jewish. So he had no trouble with all of that. The strange case of Robert Maynard Hutchins, if the name's familiar to you, he's the person who dominated life at University of Chicago in the 1930s when Gardner was there. You could not escape the grip of Robert Maynard Hutchins. And this is a discussion of basically how Hutchins, by the end of the 30s, was going off the rails. But truth be known, Gardner benefited enormously by the educational environment at Chicago, which did not exist anywhere else in the country. He was free to do anything he wanted. He could just wander into any class he wanted. If he didn't want to listen to the lectures, he could just go take the exams. He was free to do everything he wanted, and he took advantage of it. So University of Chicago is an important character almost in his story. Now, again, some of you know this, even though he had no interest in organized religion whatsoever, and he did, in the early 30s, come to the University of Chicago as a fundamentalist Christian. And this is an article he wrote to a Christian magazine in which he explains how important it is to be a Christian. He was embarrassed beyond belief that I found this article. I asked him to comment on it, and he would not even read it. But this indicates where he was when he started college, and by the time he left college, he had no interest in organized religion at all. All right. Political. He was a democratic socialist. He wrote this article for New Criterion, which he told everybody about this book, Looking Backwards by Bellamy, which I was surprised to learn is, after Uncle Tom's Cabin, the second best-selling book of the 19th century. And it was about utopians, and it was very much about how socialism could possibly work in the year 2000, which was when this was actually published as well. And it was the textbook for a lot of famous socialists over the years, and so he went back over it. He happened to think that Bellamy was unrealistic, and what he was talking about was not democratic socialism, and he had no interest in Bellamy whatsoever. Is socialism a dirty word? This is, again, a letter to the editor in a newspaper, actually a local newspaper, to where he was living. And he just basically explains to people what they should know, which is that democratic socialism is not the socialism that everybody uses and throws around incorrectly. Now, in the Freeman, again, many journals here. Everywhere, if you just focus on a very narrow topic, you won't appreciate his breadth. H.G. Wells and Russia. Again, the subtitle tells you what's going on here. It's a 1920s book that H.G. Wells, in which he explained clearly why the Russian experiment was going to fail. And nobody listened to it, and so afterwards Gardner had the greatest admiration for this book, because it was perhaps, in his view, the best thing H.G. Wells ever did. In the Progressive magazine, Gerald Smith Goes to Tulsa. He was living in Tulsa at the time. Gerald Smith was a off-the-rails socialist, and he was after him as well. Literature and other topics. Fiction. He wrote fiction. He wrote poetry. Now, his first published story was Horse on the Escalator in Esquire magazine. Not the first one. The first one that got any attention. And it was mentioned, apparently, by Red Skelton on the TV. And the editors came back and said, we want more of this, because obviously it's popular. And he published about 10 more stories in Esquire magazine, at which point the editor changed and that dried up. And so he had to find other places to publish, including really obscure places like Joker magazine. Gardner did not even know that this article was published. He had no recollection, and it took me an eBay about 10 years to find it. Again, instances of small literary magazines that he published in. The short story market was very strong before 1950 and extremely weak after 1950. So he had thought maybe he would be a fiction writer, but he realized very quickly the market was sending him to magazines like this, and so he said nonfiction's the way to go. One more, London Mystery Magazine, Crunchy Wunchy's first case. And here is a really obscure piece of poetry written for a science fiction fanzine, mimeographed on green paper. All right. Literature. Again, people in this room do know all about this because of the annotated Alice, but there's other things. A Harvard man who put an ease in Casey's manner. Okay, again, this is an article that expanded, got a life of its own, and became the annotated Casey at the Bat. I think this is interesting. In 1950, he wrote a book review of 1984. So I think, when I went to school, I learned about 1984, and it's an academic subject for high school students to read. But he realized how important it was at the time and wrote this very nice review of it. another review about Shakespeare, and I think it's just fascinating that he wrote an article about Shakespeare. And he also wrote an article about Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses, and he focused on the puzzles found in James Joyce's Ulysses. This is a little journal in which he wrote an article called The Golden Galaxy about Gold, who was a science fiction publisher ringleader at the time. Caroliana. Now, I'm not going to talk about the annotated Alice, but in Semiotica, we find an article on language. In the Saturday Review, we find this anniversary article, and again, nice place to publish, nice place to spread the word, to tell the world about Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll was not popular academically before Martin Gardner. He was a big fan of Oz, which was mentioned by some people last night. This is interesting, 1957. This is a few words from our chairman, because he was the chairman of the initial International Wizard of Oz Club. He had a great deal of interest in Wizard of Oz. The Baum Bugle, he published in several times, including this article on wordplay. This is a very interesting entry. This is an uncredited entry, which is the biography of John Snow, or Jack Snow as they called him. And he was a bizarre individual, just a strange individual, but at the same time a leading light in the Oz world at the time. And as the Wizard of Oz Club was going, he became close friends with Gardner. And but because he was incredibly poor, he spent all of his money on books. And so as a result, Gardner phoned in this obituary to the New York Times for him. Juvenile literature. Now, Gardner was never embarrassed by his contributions to juvenile literature. He considered it paying it back because he was deeply influenced by juvenile literature himself. It appeared in lots of weird places like this. And this is from Cricket magazine. And he published even in the school magazine of the New South Wales Department of Education. All right, moving on to journalism. He always described himself as a journalist, by the way. That got him off the hook. He would never say he was an expert on anything. He would always say he was a journalist. And sometimes he really was a journalist. He worked for the Tulsa Tribune and wrote articles like this. And this was almost a work-for-hire article he wrote for the Forecast for Home Economics. Miscellaneous is, as you might guess, miscellaneous. So here's the earliest thing he ever had published, so to speak. It was in Ripley's Believe It or Not in 1929. There was a fad at the time of seeing if you can get the post office to deliver stuff to Ripley. And so he sent a card which had nothing on it, and it got delivered to Ripley. And you only can tell because it has a Tulsa postmark on it that it was from him. And 5 months later, the post office announced they were not delivering anything else to Ripley. Magazine Tulsa, 1948. This is Logan Waite. He was one of the big movers and shakers in the juggling world around 1950. And so he was good friends with Martin Gardner, and there you are. So he wrote an article to publicize them. Here's an interesting thing. This is a mimeographed newsletter from the University of Chicago around 1939. Here it is. And there's actually a biography, little potted biography of him in the first paragraph, but the second paragraph says that Gardner likes to draw these little things, and you're supposed to figure out what they are. Now, these are known today as droodles because Roger Price made them popular as droodles. I just want to point out that Gardner was doing these things himself 15 years earlier. He was also a skilled caricaturist. So these are some of the things he wrote, drew for magazines at University of Chicago when he was there. There's quite a few of these. I want to point out that the soapbox there, because Gardner did, in fact, live in such a poor environment, intentionally poor. His father would have given him the money. but that he actually did have a typewriter on a soapbox. Here's another one of a professor at University of Chicago emphasizing Charles Morris's characteristics. And when he got out of the Navy, his boat put out a little souvenir book called Looking In on the Pope, and he wrote the history for that booklet. Then we get to magic. Now, you might think I'm spend a lot of time on magic because that's what you're interested in, but my goal today is to show you everything else. So I'm not going to say too much about magic. Here's something he wrote for the public in Mechanics Illustrated magazine, 1941, I think. And he, in Fate magazine, wrote, "He Writes With Your Hand," which was you notice he used the name George Groth here again. This is what he wrote for to advertise his friend Dr. Jacks, who wasn't getting enough business. And Dr. Jacks was a guy who actually used blindfolds, and so, of course, he knew all about peeking down the blindfold. An article in Argosy magazine. It happened even to Houdini. And this is one of my favorite, The Murdering Card Shark in True magazine, where we have it co-authored with a guy named John Conrad. This is an article about Erdnase. And as a result of this, he sent it in. The guy said, well, it's not spicy enough for True magazine. It's not spicy enough for True magazine, so they assigned this other author, and it's a very lurid article. It's really, really weird. Mathematical tricks and physics tricks. These magic tricks are everywhere. These are, again, not in the recreational math section. These are actually just tricks. The zombie in the physics teacher magazine, he had over 100 puzzles published in the physics teacher magazine in the physics trick of the month. The zombie glass is one of his favorite illusions. He showed it to me about 3 times. And then the magic literature itself, magic literature, I mean literature that only magicians should have access to. There is the favorite Mother Goose Rhymes. I saw a copy of it upstairs for sale. And it's very hard to get. This is a book of Mother Goose Rhymes that he rewrote so that it could become a force book. Was Erdnase Abdul Aziz Khan? The answer is no. Here is a toy that he's marketed, and it's basically a man comes up behind a woman with a cane, and he's going to goose her. And when he gets closer, magnets make her turn around and knock his hat off. And then there's articles about Martin Gardner. Lots and lots of interviews, 75 different published interviews with him. And a lot of them also in other languages. And finally, foreign language editions is a big part of the book. I have all of these languages. I found one more since I published the book. I found a Slovak edition I didn't know about. I would be very happy to be told about things I'm missing in the book. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time.